I would like to introduce our speaker today, and I had a lot of fun going over her intro and her bio. So Professor Miriam Belmaker is a Paleolithic archaeologist and paleoanthropologist. Her research focuses on environmental change in the past 2 million years, which is a departure for us, which is so much fun. And how it affected hominid biological and cultural evolution. She's an associate professor at the University of Tulsa and holds a position as associate curator at the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History in Tel Aviv, Israel. She earned a BA in prehistoric archaeology and ecology from Haifa University, Israel, and a Master of Science and PhD in evolution and ecology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. Following a postdoc at Harvard and a visiting position at the College of William and Mary, she moved to Tulsa University in 2012. Professor Belmaker has conducted archaeological fieldwork at sites dating from 2 million years ago in Israel, Jordan, the Caucasus, and Central and East Asia. She is co-director of the renewed excavation at the early Pleistocene site of Ubediyah.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Israel, in Ubediyah, Israel, with Omri Barzilai, and she is founder and director of the University of Tulsa's Comparative Vertebrate Collection, which sounds fantastic and very just different from anything that I know. So her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and many other very prestigious organizations, and her work has been published widely in very prestigious organizations. And this is a bit unusual for us, and I'm thrilled that Professor Belmaker could be here today to talk to us. So if you could join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me? Is it on? Okay. 1 minute, just make sure. Okay. So I have a confession I was to make. I was talking to Alan before, and I was explaining that when I first started, I did the standard, quote unquote, on Haifa University archaeology, biblical archaeology, what we call, or depending on what, Palestinian archaeology. That's another name for it, which has nothing to do with the current Palestinian argument. It's a holdover from the Philistines. And then I decided halfway through my MA to move to Jerusalem and get a PhD in biology because I really liked ecology and stuff like that. And I've since meandered, doing very, very ancient 2 million year old, even older than that stuff. But for this talk, I wanted to come back to some of my more quote unquote recent work that is only 5,000 years old. So I hope that's okay. I'm happy to come back to talk about my Ubediyah work. I just thought I was trying. I'll have you a easy introduction into Miriam before you kind of hit hard with all the Latin names in paleontology. So what I wanted to kind of point out is that in Israel, and people that have done a lot of ecology in Israel, there tends to be this interplay between trying to reconstruct the lands of the Bible from an ecological perspective, right? So we have Neot Kdumim, and we have the Chaybar, and we have other things that are trying to bring back the animals and bring back the plants and all that kind of stuff. And we can see that in several of the titles of Tristram was at the end of the 19th century, but again, the Bible is a very strong motif. I'm not surprisingly so. But the question that I always ask is, can we know what the reconstruction of this time period, approximately, because we don't know exactly when it happened, based on some, ecological data. So the past is the key to the present, and of course the future, which is what I'm going to allude to towards the end. So the systematic mapping of what was then Palestine began after Napoleon's invasion by several of these scholars here, primarily the Palestine Exploration Fund, which was established in 1865. And the new emerged maps, unlike the previous ones, were actual measurements of the land's topography. So we begin to see evidence on the positive, on the plus side, of actual real measurements in ecology. The downside of this, if I may say, has to do with what the environment looked like at the end of the Ottoman period. And these are just a few pictures from around, and I apologize, some of them are not as in focus as I would like, but you can get, this is what it looked like. No trees, very few trees. And a lot of our mental imagery that we can think of stems from these researchers, explorers, photos that we have, and the way we look at it. So a few things to remember is that post 7th century, there have been a lot of land use changes compared to what people consider the heyday, the Roman Empire, the Roman period, because many forests, the oak forests were all, the wood was cut down for building, heating, and fuel, primarily during World War I. A lot of overgrazing, primarily by goats, that prevented forests from regrowing. And then depopulation of areas that were cultivated, basically leaving to these large terraces, which are ubiquitous around Israel if you travel. So the main question that arose again towards the early 20th century is, was a shift or decrease in land fertility due to climate change or misuse, quote unquote, and I'll use air quotes here, by the inhabitants? Like, do we even have what's called post-Holocene? Holocene is the last 10,000 years. Post-Holocene climate changes. We all know there's climate changes beforehand, but are within the time period that we're speaking about in the, let's say, Bronze Age, Iron Age, are we expecting to find any climate change? So here's a quote from Marsh from 1864, where he primarily attributed the degradation to human misuse. And I will just summarize this, but basically, as long as the cisterns were in good order, the fertility of Palestine was unsurpassed. But when misgovernment and foreign and intense war occasioned the neglect, the reservoirs were broken and the terrace walls have fallen down. There was no longer water for irrigation, and Palestine was reduced almost to the conditions of a desert. So once again, that was opinion one. And Elwas Huntington, in his book 1911, basically said that a geographic deterministic view that the degradation of Palestine since Roman times was due to climate and not changes in human land use. And of course, like in all things academic, the correct answer is both. It's not either or in a very, dichotomous fashion. But it's important to point out is that this idea again that we're coming down from the heyday of the Roman period until this deterioration of the last Ottoman period. So is this environment that Western explorers actually saw in the 19th century indicative of the environment during the past? And as I said in the parentheses, the overarching question is, can the environment be understood as a backdrop for biblical narratives? And I'll say also for archaeological explanations. We can talk about increase in settlement size and decrease in settlement size and increase in number of population and a decrease, etc. So the first thing to talk about is sand dunes. So sand dunes that are now, now they're being quarried, but people think of sand dunes along the coast and in Caesarea, and you think of that as something that's ubiquitous to Israel, but actually it was not always there. And only after the first half of the 7th century, these coastal dunes began to form. And because the coastal dunes led to the decline of coastal towns allowed Bedouin population to move into the coastal plains and the valleys, and basically bring in their livestock, which created more dune formation. So again, this change in coastal land use resulted from this neglect and deterioration and destructions of a lot of the towns of post-Crusader Mamluk from Egypt. So what was this effect? So first of all, and let's see if I can do a little, let me see if I can make a little laser pointer here. So we see here, this is the extent of the dunes along the coast, right? And going nearly to the center, we have another batch here. But what really interesting is that as they migrated inland, they actually literally buried villages and towns and primarily agricultural areas. So by the end of the 19th century, coastal dunes were widespread and covered approximately 360 square kilometers. So that seems like, okay, dunes, but what did the dunes lead to? Swamps. I think most of us think about the rise of Zionism and the story of we got to go drain the swamps, right? And that issue, but basically the expansion of coastal dunes basically altered the coastal landscape completely, creating the swamps. So if you think about it, previously, before talking about the 10th centuries and 12th centuries, there were no swamps. That wasn't the landscape that emerged. And the swamps were created by obstructing the natural flow of the streams and rivers towards the sea. And we see here that, oopsie, where am I again? Did I lose myself? Here we are. And we see several of the rivers going towards, flowing towards the Mediterranean. And by creating these blockades, you suddenly had swamps. So by 1914, you had a lot of wetlands and seasonal winter ponds, and they were emerged over millennia, but were primarily not, if I can say, present before 2,000 years ago, and I'm giving rough guesstimates. So here's just a picture to kind of imagine things that we tend to think about, early Palestine, but again, probably not a accurate reflection of what happened before. So here's just, this is from Levine et al., 2006, and just to kind of get you, here are some of the early maps of some of the swamps from an Ottoman map. But primarily what I wanted to show you here is that these are the distances from wetlands as, of course, time progresses. And we see that you start with very close to wetlands, and slowly we kind of drift away because we drain the swamps. The other really interesting phenomena is grazing. And grazing primarily with sheep, but goat that eat everything, is an interesting kind of balance. And I'm going to take you back actually 2 million years ago, or maybe. So when we think of areas that are very wooded, let's say Central Europe, okay? And I don't know if you know the primeval forest in Poland that's still on the border of Poland and Belarus. But those forests that people think of as the epitome of like pre-human deterioration Europe are actually relatively recent. What kept the forest not forest beforehand were mammoths and big animals that do not exist anymore. And the moment you have mammoths, and I always tell my students, imagine them walking around, stomping on all the nice little saplings. Saplings don't grow, so you have an open grassland, right? And the moment the mammoths became extinct, we began to see the growth of a forest. So something similar happens, albeit on a small scale, with goats. So when you have an oak forest and there are goats, they basically come in, they eat all the saplings. The oaks need time to actually grow. And it does not leave enough time for the regeneration of the forest, especially because we have episodes of fire and things like that. One of the interesting studies, and I'm sorry it's in black and white, but basically they Mount Meron today was back in the, if I remember correctly, in '64. It looked, this is wow, I'm blanking on the name, a aerial photograph, sorry. And you see that there's not a lot of, the darker the green, the more trees, right? So it's very, very barren, right? And what they did is they were able to enclose it in the late '70s and prevent grazing from occurring. So they didn't change the precipitation, they didn't change the temperature, they just prevented goats from getting near the saplings. And what you see here is a great increase by 1992. So 30 years, you see a great increase in the number of trees. Okay, very, very dense forest. So it's again not what we expect to see. And here is the, there we go. This is cattle, goat, and we have grazing intensity, and we see the change in tree coverage. And with very, very high intensity, obviously the tree coverage decreases. And this is change in herbaceous cover, and herbaceous cover kind of stays more or less the same. So the big effect is that of grazing on the tree coverage. So I want to kind of transport you and kind of look at several paleoecological methods. I'll start by kind of doing a slight literature overview of other methods that have been done, and then talk about my work more towards the Byzantine period. So the first thing that affects tree coverage is obviously rainfall and temperature, right? So evapotranspiration. So here we have the average rainfall in millimeters per year, and we see this general pattern, the dark blue, that seems to look more or less like this forest, the Mediterranean forest that we see when we look at tree coverage. And we can look at it a little more scientifically, quote unquote. And here we have the ratio of trees to shrub, and this was measured by Avinam, Danin, and Orshan. And you look at precipitation, and you see a very nice correlation between the ratio of trees to shrub and the amount of precipitation. And this is also the ratio of subterranean storage and elements that tends to be more prevalent in drier environments. However, there are other effects that we need to take into consideration. So this is the Jerusalem Hills, and this is the Golan Heights. And the question is, why do the Golan Heights have so much grass in between the trees, right? Is it because there's less rainfall in the Golan Heights? Not really. Grazing could be. But one other thing I didn't mention before, and that is the soil type. So in the Golan, the soil is basalt. So it's a very, very low pH, and which is acidity. And in Jerusalem, we have a lot of the soil is a lot more alkaline. And we see that the amount of dense trees that grow is strongly dependent on the soil, among other things. So you try to combine all of this and put it together in one neat package. So this is the Dead Sea lake levels, and today this is just in 1931, we had the typical Dead Sea shape, which no longer exists. 2010, sorry, it was about half, and we project it to be even smaller. But over the long, this is going back minus 8,000 calendar years, we see that there have been a lot of fluctuations in the Dead Sea level, which we can measure looking at geological cores. And the Dead Sea lake levels are strongly correlated with the amount of rainfall in the Jerusalem Hills. That is the strongest correlation. So we can see here that there's some periods like the Middle Bronze Age, which the level of elevation is minus 370, which is much higher than our current minus 428 over here. Here's minus 6,000. It's an event known as the 8.2 thousand event, which was a big crisis. But just to kind of explain, going from the late bronze, there's a big drop. And the late bronze, we're talking about 1300 years ago, 1300 BC, that we basically have this, again, harsh drought and a general aridification of the Levant. Another great source of proxies are speleothems. They're basically stalagmites and stalactites. So the calcium carbonate of these, this is the Sorek cave, grows on a scale of tens of microns per year, and you can get a continuous record. It's actually amazing, a continuous record of thousands of years. And you can look at the isotope ratio. So isotopes are two different forms of the same material. And you can infer the rainfall of the region as well as temperature. So here is, again, Sorek Cave. This is what it looks like. You can date every little dot that you've sampled relatively accurately. These are years, calendar years before the present. And here are two graphs. One is the oxygen isotope. So it's the ratio between the common oxygen that has a mass of 16 divided by the mass of 18, and which is rare, very rare, and carbon 13, which is a delta carbon 13, which is a ratio between carbon 13, the mass of 13, to carbon 12. So I'll start with the carbon isotopes. And what we see here is that carbon values that are very negative tend to reflect vegetation that is a woodland vegetation. Tends to be browse, tends to be cooler, more humid vegetation. Values around -9 tend to be more grasses. And that is because of the mechanism of photosynthesis differs between the two types of plants. And we see here that, of course, around 4,000 years ago, which is about the late Bronze Age, we see a big shift towards drying out. This would be more dry compared to here, but we see that over the period from 7,000 years ago that we have a big oscillations. When we look at the oxygen, so again, here we have periods, this is going to be drier, so less negative. I don't like, it's a double negative, or, but the more positive values, so -4.5 compared to -8, are indicative primarily of drier conditions, and we have much more humid conditions early on. The third proxy is pollen. So pollen is one of the most resilient materials that we know in nature. And what's extra nice about it is that different pollen of different species, and the Latin here is not important, but this is pine, for example. I call it the Mickey Mouse pollen, have distinctive shapes that you can identify. And when we identify it, it's not a big secret. We literally make a slide and we look and we compare it to our comparative collection. So this was done by Longue in 2015, and I'm going to walk you through the figure relatively slowly. So here we have the intermediate Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age 2 to 3, Late Bronze Age Iron 1 and Iron 2. Each one of these is a different species. Again, the Latin names are not important, but you can see that they're grouped under Mediterranean trees, cultivated plants, semi-desert, and open land indicators. And we can see that during the Middle Bronze Age, we have an increase. So this is more, and we have an increase in the oak pistacea group. that decreases again after the Iron Age 1. And we see in a similar vein, we see here an increase in olives, which are more cultivated as opposed to wild. And again, we see this decrease. So what they interpreted, and now we're going to read this from right to left, is in the intermediate Bronze Age, there was moderate humidity, then it became very dry. Then you had a wet Middle Bronze Age, similar to what we saw before in the Dead Sea levels. Kind of an unknown, a very crash after the Late Bronze, a wet Iron Age 1, and slightly drying in Iron Age 2. So, and if we put years again and put this across what we interpret, the general chronology, and there are arguments about the chronology, but I would say that the Middle Bronze Age tends to talk about the Patriarch period. Then we have Iron Age 1 is going to be the First Temple period, and Iron Age 2 is Second Temple period. So now onto my work. So my expertise, believe it or not, are rodents. And people think that they're, why do I do rodents? I think they're extremely, extremely useful to determine climate. And here's the Sea of Galilee. And I'm going to talk about a specific case study that I've been working on for the past couple of years about sites that are surrounding the Sea of Galilee dating to the late Roman, early Byzantine period. And the important thing is because we do have this cogwheel between climate, environment, and society that I think is extremely important. So we have two main sites that I'd like to talk about. One is Hukuk, and the other is Khirbat Kul, and they are relatively close if you think about this is 10 kilometers to the shores of the Sea of Galilee today. So we're talking about the late Roman Byzantine period. I'm not going to get into the social structure, but again, we're talking about here and two sites that are over there. And what we notice, this is a work by Barr, is that the number of sites, the dark bar is the Hellenistic time period, the lighter gray is the Roman, and the very light is the Byzantine period. And we see that in different areas, we have different increases and decreases of the population and number of sites, right? So we see, for example, in the higher Galilee, we see a great increase towards the Byzantine area. And we see actually here in the Golan Heights, it goes from a very low number during the Hellenistic period and slightly an increase, but overall much less than we see, for example, in the Galilee. So what is the climate of the region today? I'm sure many of you do know, but just to kind of, we have a Mediterranean climate with strong seasonality. That means the difference between the precipitation in the winter and in the summer is very, very stark. We're talking about 560 millimeters a year. This Savanoid zone that we have today is this kind of grasses with a few trees, right, interspersed. The grasses that we have include a lot of wild cereals, but we have some carob trees and oak, and maybe rarely acacia. One of the interesting things that people don't appreciate, in my opinion, about the climate in Israel, if you compare it to the first picture I showed you when you have this big swath of Mediterranean climate, is the spatial heterogeneity that exists in different climates. So, for example, this is, again, by Danin and Orshan. They divided the country into distinct phytogeographic zones that differ in precipitation and temperature. And you can see here they used, for example, the precipitation, times 100 dividing by, this is called Emberger's pluviothermic quotient and Lang's rain factor. And you see that each one of these different groups actually differs in rainfall. And if you think, okay, that has no bearing on vegetation, I brought this map to show you that there's actually this area, for example, where Horvat Kor is, right, is an area of Mediterranean savanoid compared to an area relatively close by. Anybody who knows the difference between Beit Saida, for example, and Magdala, it's not a very long distance, but here already we're talking about Ziziphus and herbaceous vegetation, and the yellow here is a forest of oak. So you see how interspersed all these different environments are. So these were the reconstructions that people have come up with for the area that I am discussing around the late Roman Byzantine period. So Neumann et al. In 2014, based on a core in Birkat Ram, suggested that they're open landscape grasses. Langut, looking actually in the Negev, suggested an increase in annual precipitation. Neumann suggested again in 2007 an increase in olive production, which would be anthropogenic again. There is accounts of the 536 AD dust veil that actually led to a decrease in precipitation and temperatures. And again, looking at the Dead Sea stands, we're looking at a similar time period where it has an increase in precipitation. So the two sites that I'm going to focus on are Khirbat Kul, and here's a site. And what they discovered there was, this is the entrance to the cistern. This is the cistern itself, so a wonderful preserved cistern. And again, it was opened during the excavation in 2011, and it's this bell-shaped sealed cistern. Now, what's wonderful is because it is completely sealed, the dating was relatively good because we know exactly the cap of the ceramics. Just to show you a few nice things, here's part of the excavation, some of the ceramics and pottery, and the stratigraphy. So just I couldn't come to a talk without bringing some pots. And my colleague Frank Neumann conducted, again, a pollen reconstruction, and he identified two major time periods. So the lower one, this is again an increase in the lower levels that are probably actually more humid compared to the other ones. So first it's more humid, a little bit of horticulture, and then you have in the upper levels a silty, sandy, drier, more fire and overgrazing. The second site is Hokuk that was excavated by Jody Magnus of UNC. And just again, not related to rodents and climate, we have these wonderful mosaics, and these are just a small tad of the mosaics that appear there. In Hokuk, they found a mikveh, and the Jewish mikveh, it's interesting because it's very hard to date mikvehs in general, but it was actually excavated pretty well, and there are two floors that are sealed, and most of the rodents I'm going to talk about come from within that sandwich between the two floors, dated to, again, the Roman and Byzantine period. And I realize that it's several hundred years, but in the scheme of 2,500,000 years is nothing. So once again, they come from these two loci, one over here, locus 5005, and here is 4007. What's really interesting is that we find, and I'll give a little introduction to rodentology, we have a very wide species variability. And species in rodents are very, very reflective of the environment because they're small. and they reproduce very quickly, so they're extremely susceptible to any climatic changes. And the main species we have today in Israel as well are the common mouse, a jird or a marionus, a wood mouse, a shrew, a mole rat, another shrew, a slightly larger shrew, and a vole. And it doesn't really matter the distance because we're going to compare it to a different site. So here we're comparing Chovat Kul, right, and the Chokuk, and then we have two other assemblages. One is a modern assemblage on Gaf Stream, which is very close by, and the second is Chilbat Kul modern assemblage that was not part of the archaeological assemblage. And the first thing that you may look at and note is that we have, oh, it just doesn't make any sense. You know, sometimes the purple's up, sometimes the blue is up. We don't see anything. But I want to draw your attention to two very important species. Apodemus, which is a wood mouse, and Acomis, which is a spiny mouse. So if we zoom in on that, we see that during Chilbat Kul, or the Roman Byzantine period, or more the Byzantine period, I say, we have the presence of Apodemus in relatively similar ratios. And modern times, we have a different species. We have the spiny mouse. What's interesting, in late antiquities, we also do not have any gerbils that are ubiquitous in the area today. And these two species that arrived in the area, talking about 25,000 years ago, so they're definitely present, but are missing from the late antiquity assemblage. So the one thing we can do is there is a study that was done looking at the percentage of wood mice compared to the amount of foliage that is between 30 centimeters and 2 meters high. And you can see here, I just marked this is going to be the amount of wood mice that we had in late antiquity, and this is the amount of, I'm giving myself a little bit of leeway, but basically very, very little foliage and an increase in foliage, right, up to nearly fivefold during the late antiquity period. Another modern study that was done looked at habitat differences across, this is in the Carmel, again with 1,000 millimeters of rain per year. This is near Nazareth, which is 650 millimeters per year. And you see, again, this has a lot of Apodemus, and this has a lot, or wood mice, and here is a lot of spiny mice. So I beg your pardon with some figures, some statistical figures, but what I did was looked at the ratio between spiny mice and wood mice and average precipitation, and you can see a relatively good correlation. Not perfect, but things rarely are, but significant. And you can also look at temperature. Again, this is the ratio between more xeric and humid species. And again, a temperature increase. So there's more xeric species, obviously, when the temperature is higher, and this too is significant. So when we compare the information that we have today with that we have in predicted, which we can predict based on our equations from late antiquity, we see that while currently it's less than 500 millimeters per year in mean annual precipitation, we can predict a much higher from 673 to 800 with an average of about 750. So much more humid. Mean annual temperature basically decreases from today, which is 25 degrees centigrade, to nearly 19, let's say, but between 17 and 20. So let's just kind of take a little bit pull back and look at, this is the 5-year annual rainfall, moving average at Karei Deshe, which is where we stay when we excavate in Chilbat Kul. And you can see that obviously the years are, rainfall is not the same every year. And we know that. But we can look at mean annual precipitation from the Israel Meteorological Survey. And once again, this is Hokuk over here. This is Khirbat Kul. This is 1961 to 1990. And you see that Hokuk tends to be a little more humid than Khirbat Kul, but not overly so, right? So we're talking about, I'd say around, again, 650 is in this light blue. But what we have between 91 and 2010 is we can just see how this dryiness basically shifts the precipitation and puts Hokuk and Khirbat Kul in a much drier place than they were, okay? So we're not talking about like major changes of the entire environment, but all you need is a little bit of change in precipitation, and because of the topographical differences, you're going to have a relatively big shift in between these two ranges. And we can do a similar exercise in mean annual temperature, although we did not have two time frames here. And once again, we can see that they're very, very similar. This is actually cooler, and you can imagine this line, this presence of this line actually shifting. So, to summarize, is the region during the late Roman, early Byzantine more humid or more dry than today? And based on the data from the micro mammal, or very small mammals, we can suggest the region around Hokuk had a higher vegetation coverage, which resulted in an increase in rainfall and a decrease in temperatures compared to today. Now, the increase in foliage cannot be entirely attributed to anthropogenic factors, for example, what was attributed in the Golan, because that would not be congruent with the absence of the xeric or desert-like species. And this is consistent with what we see from the dead sea levels from the late Roman Byzantine period. So I promised you the future. So what does this tell us about the implications for modern conservation and ecology? So of course, I'm not here to quote unquote debate climate change, because the rate of climate change right now is increasing at an alarming rate. But climate change as a fact is not a unique anomaly of the last century. And our ability to infer the landscape that existed in the past based on the current environment is difficult, not impossible. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's not as simplistic as just saying, here we are, this is what we saw in the Ottoman period, this is the general, milieu, and let's, interpret the biblical narrative based on that. I'd like to raise, in my last minute or so, an issue that I think is really interesting. So obviously, Israel is very, very active in conservation efforts. And there's some kind of ideal or understanding that you want to return the environment to some perceived pristine condition at a certain period, right? And we don't know what this period is, but they say, okay, we want to return it to, again, pre-Ottoman period. Is that more correct than 5,000 years ago? What is the correct position where you're going to put the dial to decide where you're going to reconstruct the environment? If climate change happens all the time and environment changes, we're not really looking at a situation where we can say, let's turn back the dial to 2,000 years ago. It's not more accurate than 2,500 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, or even 1,500 years ago. So having said that, I always argue, I say, I don't like, again, to be the naysayer about conservation, because I'm very for conservation, but I like us to be aware that looking at these landscapes and how they changed over time is not something, I should say, trivial. Thank you so much.